This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Karl Streitel. Karl is a retired high school English and finance teacher who now works as a freelance writer and editor. He publishes his work on Substack, The Mental Lab, at mentallab.substack.com, and is the co-host of the Learning Liberty podcast at learningliberty.net, which is available on all podcast platforms. We will be talking about the public education system on today's show. Karl, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Well, Alex, thank you so much for having me. As I told you in our little intro, it's an honor to be here. I appreciate the invitation.
Well, you wrote this article back on the Mises Wire. It's been a couple of months now, and I recorded an episode on it. I'll put links in the show notes for any of my audience members that might have missed it. But your article identified a lot of the problems with public education, and you were talking specifically about how the public education system is designed to indoctrinate students to an even greater extent than a lot of people will attribute to private education or to homeschooling. And I thought that you made a lot of really great points on there, and we were able to get in contact because of that. You have a really unique background story because you are a former public school teacher. So just tell my audience a little about yourself, about your time as a teacher, what motivated you to leave. Give us a story.
Sure. So I taught in public school. It was my first and only quote unquote real job. After college, I immediately got that job, and I worked in the same school, same department, same district, my entire career. So I have a very strong insight into that one, but somewhat insular too. I haven't worked all over the country or anything like that. But I started as an English teacher, and then I branched out into the business department as well about halfway through my career. So I ended up teaching from the quote unquote lowest levels of kids in English, remedial type work, to honors. That was where I spent most of my career. And then I taught finance, marketing, and business management as well. And basically over the course of my career, it's funny because I'll think about the reviews, the kids would write on Rate My Teacher, which I don't even know if that thing still exists anymore or not.
But I don't do it anymore, at least where we're at.
Oh, okay. All right. It's probably just all on social media now anyway. But so I remember going on Rate My Teacher and seeing that, kids would write about me that I was not in not so nice terms, very strict, very militant, very regimented. And I was always proud of that. I sort of wore that as a badge of honor, that you walked into my classroom and things were going to be quiet and orderly, and we were going to get the job done. And for a good portion of my career, that's how I approach things. And as I said, I was proud of that. And I think even to this day that there are probably a lot of teachers out there who would like that for their own classrooms, to say to show that I'm sort of in charge, that's sort of the outward, view that, okay, I know what I'm doing if everyone's kind of sitting there quietly, following my directions. Over time, though, that adversarial relationship between me and the students and their general dislike of school in general basically started to wear me down. It was like erosion over a rock. It just took a long time to dig out the Grand Canyon that is Karl Streitel. So eventually I realized that a lot of what I was teaching was fairly useless to a large portion of the population that was forced to sit there every day. I had great philosophical and ethical problems with the way the system was funded. In particular, with school taxes, the fact that it was compulsory rubbed me the wrong way. And I just got tired of constantly being the enemy all the time, especially as I started to feel hey, kids, I want to be on your side, but I don't really know what to do. So I tried to find some ways to inject a little bit more freedom. I mean, using that term with gigantic air quotes, into the classroom. I exposed my kids to Rothbard. I exposed my kids to Bastiat. If nothing else, just to give them some exposure to alternate ways of thinking, to start questioning things. What critical thinking is supposed to be about, not about indoctrination and propaganda, but questioning your beliefs. And I know firsthand, as I think I I sort of alluded to in my story just a moment ago, that's basically how I got to where I was at the end and where I am now, was to start questioning everything that I had ever taken for granted. That, yeah, this system is here and 85% of kids go to it. Like, I went through it. But it has a lot of problems. And sometimes, you have to tear everything down to the ground to sort of that, the old cliche of striking the root, to be able to see what some of those problems are. And that's kind of my very long-winded journey to where I am now.
Yeah, that was a really, really great summary. And I'm really glad to have you on the show because I want my audience to understand just how bad things are in the public school system. I know that we hear from a lot of libertarians and free marketers like us. They already are suspicious of the public school system, and they're aware of some of the incentive problems that are created by taxation funded schools and about the seemingly never-ending focus on standardized testing, and all of that's true. But as I tell everybody that I talk to about this, like, if you're in the audience right now and you're listening to us talk and you think that the public schools are bad, I want you to know that it's way worse than anything you could possibly understand unless you're on the inside. So what I wanted to go through with you, and we sent some emails back and forth before this. I want to identify some of the biggest problems and kind of get your perspective on that so that we can together explain to our audience just how significant these issues actually are, and then maybe talk about how there are more free market solutions to these issues that are facing our public schools. And the great thing about this too is that you are a high school teacher, and what a lot of people don't understand is that in most states, schools are divided up into three different like units or categories. You have your elementary schools, your middle schools, and your high schools, and every single one is completely different than the other one. So I'm a middle school teacher, so what I experience on a day-to-day basis is a lot different than what you experience as a high school teacher. But the systematic problems with public education create a different set of issues at each of those levels in the school system. So I'm glad that we can kind of talk about how those impact students throughout their development in different ways. Of course, the first one that I want to get your perspective on is what is called data-based teaching. And this is one of those educational terms that means a lot of different things. But essentially, the big picture is that we have these standardized tests that we give at the end of the year, and we need to direct all of our instruction to make sure that they perform well on these standardized tests. And so we are very heavily invested in collecting data throughout the year to kind of determine where our kids are at so that they can perform well on those tests at the end of the year. I want you to break this problem out for us. Like, obviously, just even hearing that, if you're not on the inside, you would immediately think, well, that's a problem. Like, why are you focusing all of your instruction during the day on just making sure that these kids get good scores on standardized tests? Like, shouldn't it be about giving people an education? Why do we have this emphasis on data-based teaching, and why are these standardized tests so important within the current system?
Okay, so yeah, a lot of items there to unpack. I guess first of all, to the question of why do we have it, that's probably maybe the most involved, and I obviously don't have one answer to that. I'm sure in the same way that you probably don't. We might have our speculations and things that we've heard and we've seen, but I can't pinpoint one thing. I think that a lot of it does have to do with that. The taxpayer funded aspect of schools, though, because, to your point where you said, most people hear about these standardized tests and they think, oh, well, that's foolish. Why are you doing that? But by the same token, I think that there are many people out there who, especially people who don't have kids in the school, but are still paying their taxes. Like me, I don't have kids in the school, but I have to pay for everybody else's kids. So like, I get, I get a little salty sometimes. And I think, and I think some other people do as well. And I think the standardized testing movement or the database movement was born out of this idea of we want to show something to the public at large, right? Not just to the parents and to the students, but to the taxpayers. So they, basically we can prove, like, quote unquote, that we're doing our jobs, that we're giving these kids an education. And so that's my speculation anyway. That I think that, from my experience anyway, it seems like a lot of alternative schools that you had mentioned, we can get into a little bit later, but it seems like many of them move away from standardized testing to, other like skills-based testing and things like that. And I think about, well, why are they free to do that? Well, because they don't have like taxpayers looking over their backs all the time, saying, prove to me like why you're stealing thousands of dollars from me every year. Like, prove to me that these kids are getting, the 3 R's and that kind of idea. So that's my speculation as to the why the database movement comes about. It also, and I don't want to be cynical about everything, but the database movement also creates a lot of jobs. It
Yes, it does.
gives administrators in particular, right, things to do. I don't know how it is at your school, but like at my school, we had 5 principals, so one for every grade, and then like a main principal as well. And so, one or two of those principals, in many cases, a good portion of their job was dealing with data and standardized testing and things like that. And not to say like they weren't bad people or anything like that, but that creates jobs, and especially at the state level too. I mean, really the bureaucratic morass is that gives them a lot of jobs, because they're the ones who are going to pass all these regulations. They're the ones who are outsourcing the production of these tests, and they're the ones who are rolling everything else downhill to the administrators in the schools, to us as the teachers, et cetera, and ultimately to the kids. So those would be my two guesses as to the why they're doing it. I don't know if you want to pause there, like before we unpack some more of the parts of your question or not, but because maybe I don't know if you have some speculation as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with everything that you say there. I think that there are two things in particular to your point that you made. I think No Child Left Behind has done a lot of harm to the public education system because back in 2002, when the Bush administration signed that into law, essentially federal funding for federal funding to the states was tied in part to math and language arts common assessment scores at the end of the year. So that immediately created a financial incentive for states to put almost all the educational emphasis on those two subject areas, chasing those federal dollars. And every subsequent presidential administration has more or less like ratified. They've changed the name. I think under Obama it was the Every Student Succeeds Act. And, they have to reauthorize it every so many years, but that automatically pulls the education system in one direction, trying to chase those funds. And I agree with you. I think a lot of this data-driven teacher does create bureaucratic jobs. In my district, it's a little bit different because our central office is very top heavy. So we have, I teach in a middle school with about 850 kids, and we have 3 principals, which I think is the right amount of principals for that many kids, especially considering the way that American culture is today. It is a lot to manage that many, 11, 12, 13, 14-year-old students. And we need them for discipline. We need them for instructional leadership. We need them for organization. That's the role that they should be playing. But because the district is only concerned about what the state and federal government has laid out for the educational process, our administrators wind up spending a substantial amount of time involved in all of these meetings at the district level that have absolutely nothing to do with discipline and have absolutely nothing to do with providing these kids an education. It's all about chasing these bureaucratic trails. And meanwhile, we continue to hire more and more people, and they get paid a lot of money to work at our central office. None of the people, not none, but the majority of the people that work at our central office have absolutely nothing to do with providing these kids with an education or making sure that our schools are better. And honestly, like we could lay off probably 75% of central office, save the taxpayers in our county millions of dollars a year, and literally nothing would change except that our building administrators would have more time to be in their building. So to your point, I think that those are also kind of some of the issues that I think are behind this. But I want to go back to that with you too. I want to throw this back to you. So what are some of the other problems that are caused by this database teaching model, or some of the other issues, like side issues that are connected to this?
Yeah. So another one, and I actually wrote about a couple of these in a recent article too, but one in particular that, always just drove me up a wall, just, ethically speaking, is that if these tests are supposedly for the kids, number one, let's just think about that for a moment. How does the standardized test help this kid who's taking it? Like, that's what I'd like to know. I mean, we were talking about this earlier about breaking down beliefs, right? As I was discussing my background and how I got to where I am. I think that's really something that people need to ask themselves. I mean, parents in particular. I know the students do, right? The students look at most of these standardized tests and say, this is garbage. What I see no value in this. I don't know how it is for you guys in Kentucky, but in Pennsylvania, the test is called the Keystone test, and at least in high school. And like the districts basically get to choose how it impacts the students. So like in our district, they chose not to have this test show up on kids' transcripts. So like there was literally no incentive for the kids to do well. Now they would like change that from year to year. And so I related in my article like this story about how I was in a meeting one time, and it was somebody, I think it was like my department chair was telling us that this edict from the central office that, okay, this year it's not going to be on kids' transcripts, but the kids don't really know that, because it changes so often. So, one of the other teachers lamented that and said, oh my gosh, well, yeah, now like, how are we going to get them motivated to get prepared for these tests? And my department chairperson just like blithely said, we'll just lie to them. Like, we'll just lie and tell them that it does matter. And I thought, oh my gosh, look at these. Look at like what we've become. It's like Planet of the Apes or something. Like, what's going on here? That I know we're all here. Like, we're not. Again, I didn't work with terrible, nefarious people, but the system, when there is all that pressure, because what are those tests measuring then if they're not there to help the kids? They're there to judge the teachers, right? And that's really their purpose. And they don't even do a very good job of that, because at least in Pennsylvania, it's like 98% of teachers, I think, every year get rated as, proficient or higher. So, I mean, why are we going through this charade of basically just like rubber stamping this when it has no impact on the kids whatsoever? It's just really a negative experience for them. They see no value in it, and it doesn't really do anything to help teachers get better or anything like that. It's just basically busy work throughout the year. And for the state to feel like, yeah, we're checking these boxes in terms of accountability, since that's, a big word that's often tied to that as well. So I think that's two of the sort of perverse outcomes of this database movement would be teachers and administrators doing things or acting in a way that is contrary to helping kids get an education and to treat them with respect and as individuals. And it contributes to kids just, having an even more negative view towards school, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And it's even, I think that's even worse at the middle school level, because at least at the high school, you have like advanced language arts, you have advanced math, you have advanced science, you have advanced social studies. So they do differentiate classes based on ability level and skill level. So for kids that have an aptitude in a particular subject, there's more of an opportunity at the high school level for them to pursue that. But at the middle school level, at least in our state, because they're only tested every year on the math and language arts content at the end of the year, ours is called the Kentucky Summative Assessment. The KSA is our final one. They do like social studies once every 4 years and science once every 4 years. It's so messed up. But in middle school, they take what's called a MAP test, or in some districts called a STAR test, that will place them in either an advanced or a remedial math or language arts class, but they don't have those advanced and remedial science or social studies classes. So already the kids know that there's more of an emphasis on math and language arts than there is on science and social studies. And so all the math and language arts teachers, while there's definitely more pressure for them to perform, they're the ones that are getting the special ed aides in their room. They're the ones that are getting all the focus and emphasis put on them, while we're just kind of like left to dry. And I have no differentiation in my classes. I have kids that can barely read, and then I have kids that are reading on like a college level. And so how do you find a way to like educate that? You can't do it. It's not possible. And so for me, like my perspective on this, and I think it's one that we share, is that database teaching has really nothing to do with giving the kids a holistic education. Because if you really cared about giving them a well-rounded education, then you would have both advanced and remedial classes for all core content areas. And you would also, like, if you have to do end of year assessments, you would think that every single year you would test all four core content areas. It wouldn't just be like the two that also happen to be tied to all the money and all the bureaucrats and things like that. Like the again, it goes back to the incentives of the system are really, really sick. And another problem that I wanted to ask you about that's kind of related to this too is the idea of an unbiased curriculum. And you touch on this a little bit in the article that you wrote over at Mises. And this is the idea that at least from at least if you listen to the rhetoric of the education bureaucrats and the politicians, they want our public education system and our curriculum in the education system to be unbiased. Is that a possibility? And is that something that the public even really wants?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say, and it's just my opinion, obviously, I don't have any empirical data to back this up, but I would say no to both of those. So no, I don't think there is such a thing as an unbiased curriculum, because I don't think there's such a thing as an unbiased human being. At least I have yet to come across one. And since human beings are responsible for not just writing, but also imparting the curricula, then I don't see how we can have one without the other.
Yeah.
So no to that. And then no to, the idea that people even want an unbiased curriculum. No, people want to see their own biases, right? I mean, that's what we all really want, whether we admit it or not, is we want to see our own biases reinforced. And so, to a certain extent, maybe that sounds, I don't, that sounds bad to people in some way. They think, no, that's not what I want. I want my kids to have unbiased education. But no, I don't. I would argue, at least, I don't think you really do. And I think if you think for a moment about whatever your pet peeve happens to be, whether that's gender issues in schools, or the pledge the Pledge of Allegiance every morning, or whatever it is. Like, I don't care what perspective you have, but imagine like that were a major part of the curriculum on a daily basis, whatever your pet peeve happens to be. Would you still say that you want an unbiased curriculum, or excuse me, like, let's say that were half of the day, to quote unquote balance it out? Would you still be okay with that? And I don't think that most people would be, and say, well, hey, yeah, look, hey, well, it's just fairness. It's just fairness. Like, yeah, we should spend half the day on gender education, because that's the other side. Or we should spend half the day slavishly supporting the military, because, hey, like, that's the other side. Like, obviously, like, again, I have yet to come across a human being who is that forward thinking to say, or that evolved to say, oh yeah, sure, that sounds right to me. So no, I think, like, we want to see that a particular bias. I think most of us are okay maybe with students being critical thinkers and being able to question those biases. But ultimately, I mean, it's the reason that people send their kids to parochial schools, for example, because they want them to be educated, but they want them to be educated with a certain bias, whatever that happens to be. So I'll pause there, because I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that too.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree, and I want to get your perspective on this, because I think that again, assuming that the public schools are not going to be abolished tomorrow, and we're going to have to live with them for a while, which I know that both you and I think we're both kind of in the position where the only real equitable education system is one that's completely privatized. I think we probably, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit too. But my thought on that is that if we are going to, like, I agree with everything you said. I think that this is why decisions about curriculum are best made at the local level. And so I don't think it's good that we have the federal government and that we have even state governments making decisions about curriculum. I think there are a couple of reasons for this. One, because I think that, like, the local taxpayers that are actually funding their schools should have more of a say in what their kids are being taught in school. And then also, if you just look at like even just like the geographical and the economic diversity of the United States, within the state of Kentucky, I teach right now in kind of it's like a rural suburban school. It's very, very weird. We have kids that like come from the holler, but also kids that live in nice subdivisions. It's a very weird location. But then also within the same county, there is one, it's a different district, but it's a very urbanized area in the north. And obviously the kids that are at my school have a very different set of needs and a very different set of career prospects or college prospects when they're done. And so, like, ultimately, I think that they should be learning different things at their schools. So I guess my question to you to follow that up is, given the public school system and how it exists, like, how do we arbitrate, like, what is taught in the classroom? Who gets to decide?
That's a tough question, because yeah, like, as you said, like, in its, if we're talking about in its current form versus a different form, in its current form, I don't think I have a good answer to that. I mean, I guess I would have to defer to what you said a moment ago, which is at the most local level. But even then, if the last few years have taught us anything, I mean, it's like, even the local level isn't really a savior, because, I mean, like, even where I live, I saw front yard signs for school board members saying, like, stop the woke agenda. And then other, competing signs, quote unquote, of, the love is love and that kind of stuff. And it's like, so, even on the local level, you can't please everybody, because, especially when it comes to education, because I just mentioned this on my podcast earlier today, that to me, learning is like DNA. Like, learning is as unique as DNA. Like, that's, I think if teaching taught me anything, it's that everybody learns so, to a certain extent, so much differently from everybody else, that even just to have a one size fits none system. Even if it's like 10 people trying to make a decision about that, I think that's going to be problematic because you're going to have 10 different people, with potentially 10 different needs. I mean, it's like, how often, I would just ask you and your audience, like, think about for a moment, like, how often can you get 10 of your friends together to agree like on an activity or like a food? If you're just going to do one, like, we're just going to be like, all right, everybody, like, let's get together. And when we go out to eat, everybody has to order the same thing. Like, all right, let's agree. I mean, come on, with 10 people, how often is that going to happen, as opposed to everyone just saying like, the heck with this, I'm just going to go out to eat by myself. So I I don't, Alex, I wish I had a better answer in the current system, like, what can we do? I guess I'll have to fall back on, like I said, what you said, of the best we have at this point, I think, is just, the local school districts and parents pulling their kids out of those districts when they don't agree with what's being taught, or they don't like the way that things are being taught, their kids aren't being served, et cetera. I think, vote with your feet in the places where you can, vote with your dollars. I think that's the best option that I'm aware of in the current system, is just like, one thing they understand is money. And so in those places where you can, take your dollars with you, do it. If the system isn't working for you, speak that way. That's much louder, I think, than getting up at a school board meeting and, potentially being labeled a terrorist or something like that. So, not to get too political about things, but so, like, in a different system, though, even like a slightly different system, if you take compulsion out of it, like, that's what I always tell people, that I'm not in favor of abolishing government schools necessarily. I'm in favor of abolishing compulsion, the compulsory attendance aspect of them, and the compulsory funding aspect. Like, if you still want to have that local school down the street, and you say, hey, that's serving my kids just fine, more power to you. I just want, you to pay for it without me. And I don't think that I have any right to tell your kids that they have to go there. So to me, it seems like a win-win for both of us. But I don't want to get too tangential to the question that you just asked. So did I approach something resembling a question, like he says in Billy Madison?
Yes,
Okay.
that was absolutely perfect, and that actually does segue directly into what I wanted to ask you next. Just as a to kind of put a pin in that too. Anyone that's listening that still thinks that there is a place for public education, whenever you have a system like that, Karl, as you just said, there are always going to be these ethical and philosophical contradictions. Like, you cannot make everyone happy. And if everyone's forced to pay for something, but then you're providing one group of people that are paying for that with a service that they want, another group of people with a service that they don't want, that's always going to be unjust. And I just want people that still believe in the system to hear that. Like, there's no equitable, fair way of determining what is taught in a public school. It just can't be done. And that's a tension that if the public school system remains unabated, we have to live with. This does go to the next point that I want to talk to you about, was you claim that the system disrespects students. And I completely agree with that. And I also think that it disrespects parents, and I think that it disrespects taxpayers. So walk us through some of those things. In what ways are the school system, as it's currently conceived, disrespectful towards students and the wider community that's supporting them?
Okay. I think students are probably the most disrespected of those groups. And of course, I would argue that the most important, because ostensibly anyway, they're the whole reason for the reason for the season, as they say. So I'll come back to them, because otherwise I feel like I'll get sidetracked, and that'll be the only one that I'll mention. So how are taxpayers disrespected? Well, I think that one's pretty easy. That one's short, because being a taxpayer means you're disrespected. So that's pretty simple. And again, like, to your listeners, I'm not trying to be like blithe about that. I think that's, to me, like, that's an unarguable fact, that you might argue with me and say, like, okay, taxes are necessary for X, Y, and Z. Okay, fine. But that's not what I'm arguing. I'm saying, is taking people's money against their will, is that theft? Like, yes or no? It's just that simple. And if it is, like, 99% of people, I believe, teach their kids that would be theft, right? Like if you came home and you found that I had, hacked into your bank account and taken $10, regardless of what I had done with that money, that doesn't mitigate the fact that I stole from you. It's not like the Robin Hood thing where you just excuse it because you say, well, I mean, he donated it to orphans. So yes, hack away, Karl, go for it. Go into my account anytime you want to. So I'll leave it at that with the taxpayers thing. Like just by virtue of being, fleeced, so to speak, they're disrespected. And I also think that they're disrespected because they think, and perhaps rightly think, that they have some say in what goes on in the schools because they're paying for it or they're subsidizing it at least. And again, I don't think that that's a wrong view, but as you pointed out, it's an impossible view because you have too many, all these interest groups that all rightly say that they have, some voice in what's going on here, much like the 10 friends going out to dinner, say that there's like an 11th friend who's, who has to pay for 50% of the dinner. It's like, well, I'm not going to be there, but shouldn't I have some say in like what you can buy? Like, I don't want you buying shrimp or, whatever, Delmonico steaks or something. So it's like, not to beat the analogy to death, and I'm starting to get hungry too. But other than that, like, so the taxpayers are disrespected, I think, in those two ways. Parents disrespected for much the same way that the latter of the taxpayers' ideas that I just mentioned, in that they should have like the most, I believe parents should have the greatest say. And I'll temper that with, in elementary school, probably, and then like middle and high school, I'd say, maybe like the students just as much as the parents should have a say. But like, they're like one or, like 1A, 1B in this scenario where they should be able to have, a say in what goes on in the school and what their kids are learning. And so anything that interferes with that, which is basically the whole system, because parents have very little say in what goes on in that system. I remember times where now again, like parents can push it a little bit, but most don't, where, there was an obvious personality conflict. I know this is hard for people who are listening to this to believe, but some of my students had personality conflicts with me and I with them in some cases. You would think, like, logically, perhaps one of the solutions to that might be to change the situation. Like, they could be in another class that they don't have to deal with me for 180 days. But like that was almost verboten that, we never want to talk about that. And even if parents wanted that, it was something that, the administration is going to fight against because, well, we don't change classes. You can't just pick your teacher. It's like, wait a minute, why not? Why? What do you mean? Why can't I pick? Like, everything else in my life, I'm allowed to choose. It's not like I go to the grocery store and they say, whoa, like the old Henry Ford line, you can have any color car as long as it's black. I mean, that doesn't, like, why? There's another teacher right over there. So that's how I think like parents are disrespected, because they only have it's really, the guise of a say, like the guise of power in this system, but they don't really, it's the same problem that I think is common to any type of democracy, whether it's a school board or whether it's, Congress overall, that they sort of can excuse everything by saying, well, you got to vote. It's like, yeah, but if the vote didn't really get me what I wanted, I don't, or what's good for my kids, like then I'm just supposed to like shut up and take it. And so to me, like that's just disrespectful overall. And then for the kids, oh my gosh,
this is the big one.
This is the big one. Yeah, I'll just reiterate that story that I told about, the lying to them. That happens, I think, in various ways on a daily basis. I think especially in terms of whether it's overtly or tacitly, when we as teachers will tell them about, for example, like the importance of their grades. Spoiler alert, they're not really that important. I'm not going to say that they're not important at all. In my mind, unfortunately, I think that they still are, but really it only matters like maybe to get you into college. But, after that, nobody cares about, the A+ that you got on your third grade spelling test. So this insane, in my opinion, and ill-placed pressure on kids, especially these days, that's something that I definitely saw increase over my 2 decades as a teacher, was the pressure from that kids and parents and society is putting on these kids, like every single test, every single assignment, especially in the honors and AP classes, where they're just so driven to succeed, but they're driven by grades. And so, as teachers, as a teacher, I played into that. So I think that's disrespectful because it's a lie, and I think it's extremely detrimental to kids, especially emotionally and mentally, to their well being. I've said it before. I'll say it again, that I'm sorry to all the students I taught, especially the ones who felt undue pressure because of things that I did or things that I said. That's terrible. So I think that's a big issue. How students are disrespected. I think they're also disrespected. Perhaps the obvious one is because they're simply not treated like autonomous individuals. Especially now, I think it's perfectly reasonable to treat kids like autonomous individuals from kindergarten, preschool on. And I think that there are many models out there, like the Montessori model, for example, that show that, like, I'm not just blowing smoke here. Like, this isn't just one dude's opinion, that they have track records of success with treating kids with respect and letting them make their own decisions, and showing just amazing growth for kids who are actually treated like human beings as opposed to like cogs in a machine, or like in some cases, almost worse than pets, that they have to rely on teachers for everything. So again, I don't want to go on too much, but so those are, I lost count, two different ways, three different ways that I think that students are disrespected too. So I'll pause there.
Yeah. Well, let me, I want to bring in the compulsory education thing too, before we talk a little more about taxes and then maybe how we can solve some of these problems. But one of the issues with compulsory education is that these kids are forced to go to school. And like, I think you and I would both agree that there are some kids that just should not be in school. They don't want to be there. They don't have any interest in learning. Their parents aren't paying taxes into the system. And I know we'll talk about that when we talk about how funding schools via property taxes are a part of this problem as well. But for me, especially in a middle school context, one of the biggest challenges is that we have kids that show up to school every day that will just bully other kids, and they're disrespectful towards teachers, and they cause disruptions in the classroom. And so you might have a classroom with 30 kids, 29 of them want to learn, but that one kid, you have to spend a lot of time and effort making sure. And then a lot of times, like for me, I'm kind of like you were. You almost have to, especially with the way the middle schoolers are today, be a disciplinarian and make sure you have control before you can get them to learn anything. Because if one person's out of control, the rest of the class can't learn anything at all. And it's very difficult to get those kids removed from school. Like, most school districts have stopped funding alternative school programs because the progressives think that it's unjust for those kids to be out of the classroom, and the conservatives, I guess, for once in their life, don't want to spend money on something. It's a whole weird dynamic there. But it's like, but a lot of these kids, like, they actually put other kids in danger, and they'll physically assault other kids and bully them and humiliate them and make it difficult to learn. And so we disrespect the vast majority of kids that want to show up and learn every day, and whose parents like want to keep them in these schools so that they can get an education, by allowing the very small minority of kids to get away with doing pretty much anything they want. And this isn't like, and again, a lot of people from the outside will look at this and say, well, why don't the principals do something? Because the principals can't do something. Like, the states are the ones that craft the legislation and the regulations that determine how kids can and can't be disciplined in classrooms. And they've loosened all those standards and made it almost impossible. And then we also have this problem too, where at least in middle school, like, we don't have in Kentucky a credit system. So you can come in, I had a kid that did this last year. You can walk into every single class and just stare at a wall all year long, turn in none of your assignments, and fail all of your classes all 4 quarters. And then the next year, you're going to be in the next grade level. There's like no accountability. Now, if that kid's parents want them to be held back so they can learn again, then they will. But the kind of kids that come and sit and stare at the wall all day long are not the kind of kids that have parents that care about their education. So you're right. Like, all of those problems are systemic, and the school system is just, again, it goes back to the idea that the public education system is not designed to educate students. It's become more of an extension of the welfare system and a way for certain politicians and constituents to buy votes. And these kids have become a battleground for certain culture war issues. And that's pretty much the end of the story for that. And again, I think a large part of this. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry. I just wanted to mention, I don't know, because that was, it's funny, like half of an article that I wrote was about like the actual violence that kids experience in school. So I'm glad that you brought that up, because apparently I don't even remember my own writing, my own points. But I just want to mention, like, for your audience, if they're unaware of this, that actually, I think it was the data from like 2021 maybe, or 2022, but fairly recently anyway, that kids for that under 18 group, kids experienced more non-fatal violent incidents inside school than outside school across the United States, right? In that year. So, I mean, just think about that for a second, that, kids are in school for, counting a bus ride, 7.5 hours a day, roughly. So you're not even talking a third of their day. And these kids experienced more violent incidents during that slightly less than 1/3 of a day than they did in the other 2/3 of their days. I mean, that is absolutely unconscionable that that we let that go on. And as you said, there are a variety of reasons behind that. A lot of it has to do with, as you pointed out, like hamstringing what people can do about some of those problem situations. And I just think about, when you describe those kids who can just kind of like show up and do nothing and then still graduate, I, because I'm a very judgmental person by nature, my first thought is always like, oh my God, look at this person, just, what a waste. And then I think for a minute and say, you know what? Yeah, what a waste of potential. What a waste of human capital. Like, what I do believe that everybody can contribute something positive to the world. Like, yeah, everyone's not going to be an Elon Musk or entrepreneur or anything like that necessarily, but people can contribute something positive. They can contribute something of value to the world, and they can get value back, and in the sense of making money, having a purpose, etc. And I think that kid who's sitting in the classroom doing nothing, and this applies to so many kids, not just the ones at the extreme end of the spectrum, like you were describing. I mean, it described me for at large swaths of my education, where couldn't I have been doing something better with my time, like better for me and better for society? Which I always find interesting. The people who sometimes crow the loudest about, oh, we want to help society, we want to help the world, heal the world, that kind of thing. Okay, fine. Like, let's start with not wasting kids' time. Like, let's start with letting kids do something constructive. Like, let's not shut down their lemonade stands, so to speak. Sometimes, in an actual way. But why aren't kids, being more entrepreneurial? Why aren't kids shadowing more people at work? Like, why aren't kids? Why does school have to be so separate from life and the real world? That it's literally this separate building. And then the kids go outside and it's like they have to kind of shade their eyes or something, because it's the first time they've seen the sun in like 8 hours. So, like, to me, that's also one of the worst things that happens with quote unquote traditional school, whatever form that might take, whether it's government or even like the Catholic school that I went to. Same basic idea though, right? It's like I was still on that traditional schedule, and I feel like for many kids, not all, but for many kids, it's just a waste of much of it is a waste of their time and a waste of their potential, when there are better ways for them to be part of society and be part of life, and not have the two so bifurcated all the time.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that's what the phrase that they use in public education, and by they, the people that craft educational theory, the universities and the bureaucrats and the politics, the phrase that they use is that kids should leave high school, career, and college ready. But to your point, like, what career or college do you go to where you don't do anything all day long and you automatically get transitioned to the next level, or you get a promotion or whatever at your job? Or what career can you go and get where you can be like sexually or physically harassed by another person repeatedly without there being any sort of discipline? Like, our schools are not preparing our kids for college. They're not preparing them for a career, and they're not preparing them for real life. Right. You also make the argument, and this is kind of the last problem that I want to talk about. I know we got about 15 minutes left here. Sure. This is the last problem I want to talk about before we talk about reforming or abolishing or alternative, like how we can fix this, is how does school funding via property taxes exacerbate all of these problems? So we've identified a lot of systemic issues. How does the funding method of taxation make these issues even worse?
Okay. Yeah, and so I'm going to tread a little bit of the same ground that we've covered, to hopefully maybe pull some of these ideas together. So to just, I won't really focus on then the idea of theft and stuff like that. I feel like we've covered that already, and I don't want to, get too far afield of that. So I'll just kind of focus on what that does to the system as a whole to make it what it is today, which obviously I think is at the very least doing a disservice to students, if not outright harming them in many cases. So anyway, the idea of compulsory funding and funding through taxation means that you have a very dispersed funding for theoretically very narrow benefits, which right there means that you can avoid a lot of the responsibility for what's going on, because it's sort of like everyone in the village is taking care of this. Therefore, it's hard to just point at one person and say, well, like, hey, Bill, like, you had responsibility for public schools, like, you really screwed up on that one. We are all part of that system basically, and I think that's why many of us, when you look at those public opinion polls, what do we see? It's like people have very low opinions of public schools, except the local ones, right? Then all of a sudden they're awesome, right? It's like, oh well, yeah, the school down the street from me, whoa, that's not the one I was talking about. Like that one's okay. So I think it also creates perverse incentives for the people who are involved in the system, because they don't have to directly answer to the parents and the students, right? I mean, as a teacher, yeah, like sometimes I'd have to hear from an irate parent or something, but the bottom line was, it's not like my job was really in jeopardy because one parent, was dissatisfied. Or even if I had a class of 30 kids who couldn't, who just hated my guts, so what? Like, what are they going to do to me? I mean, again, as long as I'm not like throwing them up against a blackboard or something, then it's like, hey, what the heck? So it creates these incentives for people to, and again, there are many, many good teachers out there, but there are also some terrible teachers who have been coasting for 3 decades, and really have no business being around kids. But hey, because it's funded by taxes, the parents can't, number one, they can't even, they don't have very much power to say like, hey, we want to get rid of this person because we have all these regulations and this person is going to get paid anyway. And number two, even if they leave, even if the parents take their kids out of the school, still in some areas of the country, in many areas of the country, they still have to pay for the school, right? They still have to pay their taxes. So it's like, what was that person's reward? Like, so that teacher who was crappy, look at that person's incentive. I can basically do nothing and potentially have one fewer kid in my class if those parents leave the district, and I still get exactly the same pay. Yeah. And I get a nice raise next year as long as I just continue breathing. Yep. So like that to me creates those perverse incentives because of the taxpayer structure. It divorces, the consumer, so to speak, from the buyer from the seller, basically, which is, something that, we'll get to with the alternatives, that for the most part, they've eliminated that problem because, they have to rely on people being happy for their funding, not on, like in Pennsylvania, for example, I'll give you, when it comes to taxes, like a local district can raise taxes up to a certain percentage every year without any vote. And so, whatever the index is that the state gives them that year, let's say they can raise the taxes like 3%, and they don't have to ask a soul to do that, right? So, gee, I wonder what happens every year. Like maybe they max out the index, every single year. So what's their incentive to provide something better, for that 3%? It's like we see in most government services. Again, not to go off on a tangent, but I think, most of us can agree, however you feel about the government, like it's true. What's the DMV's, the DMV employee's incentive to be, kind and polite? Like that person's going to have a job no matter basically what he or she says to you. So it's sort of the same thing, I think, because of taxation in the districts, that we've, eliminated that market feedback mechanism, so to speak, that, is so important for making sure that people are actually being served by the products and services that they're buying. To put it in market terms, I guess.
Yeah, and one of the things, again, a lot of people don't think about it this way, but I think that we absolutely have to make this point, going back to the fact that all these schools are funded by taxation. This isn't like a neutral for the community. And we talked already about how it's disrespectful to taxpayers, but just in my own community, I see these problems taking place in our public schools, and I see how our central office wastes, literally wastes millions and millions of dollars a year on initiatives that have nothing to do with education. But then I look around at like some of my elderly neighbors who, because of inflation, are struggling to buy groceries and struggling to pay their utility bills. And they've had these houses for a long time, but man, they're required to continue to pay their property taxes to fund this public school system. But if they didn't have to pay into this system, they'd be much better off financially. And so we're screwing over a lot of people that are in reality very at risk by funding all of these initiatives in school that aren't actually providing kids with an education or making their lives better in any way. So there are all of those problems. And it's not just about the schools. It's also about how it impacts the community, which I guess leads me to my last set of questions here.
Go
ahead. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you again.
That's perfect.
And I promise I'll keep this one short, but that's perfect. What you mentioned about the senior citizens and people on fixed incomes and things like that. Like, I'll just make a quick point that I would also hope that people would start to think about too. If you have, let's say you have a community where you have a very, very poor family, they're right at the legal poverty line or something, but they have no children, right? It's just, a husband and a wife, let's say, living together. They could theoretically be subsidizing the education of a family who makes $1 million a year. I mean, in very, very few areas that I can think of, do people actually pay what it costs to send their kids to public school. I know here it costs $22,000 per kid in my district where I live. And I pay about $5,000 per year in property taxes. So, I don't think the person with the most expensive house in this district pays $22,000 a year in school taxes, right? So that means, right, what does that tell us? That, as you pointed out, that the people who, whether you have kids or not, but especially the people who don't even have kids, they can be at the very, very bottom of that income or wealth distribution of society, or the wealth brackets in society, and they can be subsidizing to a certain extent the kids of the wealthiest people in society too. Which again, I think regardless of where you stand on conservatism or progressivism or libertarianism, I think most people can agree that doesn't seem right.
Yeah. It does not make a lot of sense. And that's where I guess, we have to kind of put a pin on this here.
Yeah.
Well, not put a pin on it, but I guess get to the climax of what we're discussing today. Do we reform the current system? And if so, how do we do it? Or should our goal be abolition? And if so, what do we replace it with?
Okay.
Or is it a mix of both?
So I would say, I'm going to take the Murray Rothbard view. I think if I'm going to, if you're going to follow anybody, follow Murray. And if I'm not bastardizing his view too much, but the idea that whatever we can do to start to break down the current system, to break down that injustice where we see it is a good thing. As long as we're not compromising our principles, then we should do it, right? Whatever is going to get us to this point expeditiously, even if it's a half measure, I think I'm in favor of, because to me that any step right towards liberty is a good step. Any step towards treating people with respect is a good step. So to your question of what form does that take, though, I don't think abolition is likely. That's obviously what I would like, because, not to be too hyperbolic about it, but I do think that as soon as you put compulsion into things, it is like a form of slavery. Again, we don't have to be hyperbolic, but yes, it's not 1860 slavery, but it is a form of that, and stealing people's money, right? You're forcing them to work for you, basically. But anyway, so I don't I would love to be an abolitionist, and in my heart I am, but I don't think that that's a realistic, quick solution that's going to happen. So I think what's most likely right now is for people to utilize the alternatives that are out there and to continue to start their own. Because, since the COVID lockdowns, we've seen just this explosion, this fantastic explosion of, these non-traditional, alternative, whatever we want to call them, learning options like micro schools and pods and homeschool cooperatives. And, I know you've detailed this too, the gigantic growth just in quote unquote standard homeschooling too. So I think the more students, the more parents who utilize those options and start their own and encourage other people to start their own, that's probably the most likely and the most expeditious way to get to what I think most people want, which is, again, like kids being treated well and learning well and finding what works best for them. So I guess that's kind of what I see as the most likely course of action, and the one that I've sort of put my chips on, myself in terms of trying to get with my own podcast, like help people to see what some of these options are and give them some information about how to reach them and sort of how to like exit the public school system.
Yeah, and honestly too, if it's okay to push back at the public schools as well. So if you're a taxpayer, you should be in contact with your Board of Education. You should be in contact with your central office. Anytime you see something happening that you think is unfair, unjust, that is not providing an education for these kids, then you should push back on that. And for other teachers that might be listening to this too, I mean, I've stuck my neck out there a couple of times. There are going to be one or two people listening to the show that know exactly what I'm talking about. And sometimes you have to put yourself in that position and speak out against the things that you think are wrong. But again, the way that I look at it, especially as a Christian, is that I have a moral obligation to love and serve my neighbor and to love and serve my community. And if I see that there are people that are making decisions that are not in the interest of the average person, using their money and not providing them the service that they're saying, then we have to speak out against that. And so any way that you can push back against the system, any way that you can push for reform, you should absolutely do that. And again, I encourage, like, we're not, unfortunately, just, with where we're at in life right now, we're not in a position where we can take our kid out of public school. But if you have the opportunity to do that, then it's definitely worth exploring those options. And if that's not a possibility, then you should be as invested in your kid's education as possible. And you should make sure that you know what's going on in your kid's school. Karl, the last question I want to ask you here is, what do you think about the prospects for the public education system changing for the better? I am of two minds on this. Part of this, I think a part of the reason why I'm negative about this, why I'm not optimistic that things are going to change, is because I'm on the inside of the system and the bureaucracy seems so massive and so oppressive. But I live that every single day. And when I step outside of that world, I see that there are a lot of people that are pulling their kids out of these schools. I see that there are a lot of people that after COVID aren't just going to accept what the teachers and the administrators and the bureaucrats and the politicians say about the school system. They're willing to do their own research and they're willing to be more critical. And so on the one hand, from the inside, it seems very negative. But from the outside, it does seem like now more than ever in American history, there is a real opportunity to make some very positive changes and to kind of push back against this system. So what do you think about the future? Realistically, are we going to be able to make better improvements to the public education system?
Yeah, my crystal ball is cloudy. I'll say that. I don't, again, like the pessimist in me and the experience in me says probably not, because I have yet to see like a government program that has responded positively to, market forces. It usually seems like they just dig in their heels and become more ossified in their ways. Again, just speaking like historically. However, it's entirely possible that maybe the public school system will be, because it is so fragmented in the sense of, right, all these individual districts around the country. So it is entirely possible that you might have individual districts that say, oh my gosh, like we're losing so many kids to these other options that maybe we should find out what those other options are doing and see maybe how we can copy them to try to keep some of our kids. And you see this especially in inner cities. I mean, I just read statistics about the growth of homeschooling and stuff seems to be most pronounced among minority communities, the black community and the Hispanic community in particular. So it's very possible that, and maybe that's kind of like a white pill that we could, sort of end on, is that maybe in some of those areas that so many people are so vocal about this and so action oriented in terms of taking their kids out, that the powers that be in those areas have no choice but to respond by changing their ways. So, like I said, I don't hold out a lot of hope for that, unfortunately, just because of my own experience, but I'm willing to be proven wrong, and I would be gladly proven wrong if that means that, again, kids are able to get a better education and be treated like human beings.
Well, Karl Streitel, I think that's a very positive note to end this conversation on. Before I let you go, where can people find your work and follow you? And I guess tell them a little bit more just about what you do.
Sure. Basically, I I do a little bit of freelance writing. I do some editing, and I just started a podcast. We only have 2 episodes, so but I write at the Mental Lab, which is mentallab.substack.com, and my podcast is entitled Learning Liberty, and you can find that on all the main platforms and at learningliberty.net. So as I said, we're a nascent podcast, but hopefully growing, and our whole goal is to interview people who are involved with alternative learning options, so that parents, students, other people who are interested in those options can kind of hear about that from the inside of each of those, so that they can, our tagline is better learning options for better lives. So that's kind of what our goal is.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I'll put links to show notes for all of that or I'll put links in the show notes for all of that there. Again, I know that a lot of people in my audience, they're really interested in this. We've done a lot of episodes. They've seemed to have been doing really well in the public education system. So if you like what you heard today, go and check out all of Karl's stuff. Karl, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
No, thank you for having me. It was a true pleasure.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.